When you talk the Middle East, it was relatively settled. It looks to me as though American foreign policy in the Middle East in the last 4 years has been terrible and has really encouraged the emergence of a very dangerous situation. But Trump recently indicated that the Israelis ought to go after the nuclear facilities and then clean up the mess later. Was he right, do you think?
Well, there's no question that something has to be done, or Iran is going to become a nuclear power with nuclear weapons. And if that happens, then everything changes.
Everything changes.
Irrevocably in the Middle East. And in a way that is profoundly dangerous to the state of Israel. The key thing to remember is that the theocratic regime in Tehran is committed to wiping Israel from the face of the earth and has been doing everything in its power to enable the terrorists who hate Israel and want to kill Israelis in recent years. I agree with you that US policy under the Biden-Harris administration has been very ineffectual in the Middle East. The best evidence for that was Jake Sullivan's very unfortunate piece in Foreign Affairs, published just before the October 7th, 2023 attacks. In the piece, he wrote that everything was looking really good in the Middle East and things had more or less been more peaceful there than in many years. Unfortunately for him, he went to press just before Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched their atrocious rampage and massacre. So that was the beginning, I think, of a series of errors of judgment. The United States has consistently called for a ceasefire. It's consistently called for Israel to give Hamas breathing space. Thankfully, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ignored these calls and has prosecuted an extraordinarily effective campaign of retaliation against Hamas, largely wiping out Hamas as a force in Gaza. And more recently and spectacularly, Mr. Netanyahu has taken out Hezbollah's leadership. He didn't just decapitate Hezbollah, he eviscerated it. This is an extremely impressive, almost Godfather quality process of retaliation. It reminds me of that scene where Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino, is at the baptism of his child, and while the child is being baptized, all the enemies of the Corleone family are being taken out. Well, that's what Netanyahu has done, and he's done it against the advice, despite the pressure applied on him by Washington, D.C. And that's a remarkable achievement. It's hard for an Israeli leader just to ignore what the President of the United States is saying. But I think he was very right to do that. It's put Israel in a strong position because Iran's defenses were largely outside Iran. Hezbollah was the biggest deterrent against Israel attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. It's largely gone now, not wholly. And I think Israel has the opportunity right now, in the coming weeks and months, to take further military action directly against Iran, because Iran, after all, has directly attacked Israel twice. And although it's impossible for Israel single-handedly to wipe out Iran's nuclear facilities, it can set them back several years. And I think that that must be the right move to make at this point, whether or not the Biden-Harris administration supports it.
The right move for Israel, or the right move, in fact, for all of us?
I think it's the right move for Israel. I think it's the right move for all of us, because we can't possibly want Iran to become a nuclear-armed power. Even if Iran only used its weapons against Israel, John, I think we have a moral responsibility, we who are British, American, Australian, to ensure that there is never a second Holocaust. The state of Israel exists, ultimately, because of the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust showed that the Jews could not be safe without a state of their own. And I think we have a moral responsibility to ensure that there is no second Shoah. What Hamas did on October the 7th, 2023, was in effect a trailer for a second Holocaust. I know that's how my Jewish friends saw it. I know that's how my Israeli friends in particular saw it. I'm not a Jew myself, but I've spent a lot of my career studying Jewish history. I wrote a book in which the Holocaust plays a central role, War of the World. And so I recognized immediately what Hamas was trying to communicate. So I think it's extremely important to take Iran literally and seriously. there's no question in my mind that they wish to destroy Israel. If they have a nuclear weapon, we must take very, very seriously the danger that they would use it. And I don't think we can take that risk. None of us can take that risk.
It would surely also start an arms race right across the Middle East. The Saudis would feel they had to have nuclear armaments, which raises another interesting issue, of course, which is that despite our ambivalence in the West, we've not taken enough notice of the fact that many countries in the Middle East are plainly, quietly hoping that Israel will degrade Iran.
Well, this is one of the strategic things that Donald Trump got right in his first term, and that was to back reconciliation between Israel and its Arab neighbors and near neighbors. The Abraham Accords were one of the great achievements of the Trump administration, and that process could have carried on if Trump had been re-elected in 2020. Instead, it was derailed. We got a whole bunch of Obama holdovers back in Washington saying we need to resuscitate the nuclear deal with Iran. We know where that led. It relaxed the sanctions in Iran. The resources Iran got from selling its oil went straight to Hamas. But it's still possible to revive the Abraham Accords process. I think the Saudis would quietly welcome a return of negotiations with Israel and the United States. There is no great love lost for the Palestinians in Riyadh, in truth. And so I think if Trump is re-elected, there will be a resumption of that process that we saw in his first term. And that, I think, will help greatly to stabilize the region. Compared with 50 years ago, when you think back to the last surprise attack on Israel in 1973, Israel's much less isolated, in truth. It may look isolated at the United Nations General Assembly, but in the region it's much less isolated. And Bibi Netanyahu's grand strategy of putting the emphasis on Iran, emphasizing that it is the threat to regional stability, and trying to find common ground with the Arab states, has brought Israel out of real diplomatic isolation. So I think a tremendous opportunity has now arisen to break the Iranian theocracy and to create an enduring peace, not just between Israel and Egypt, that was done long ago, but throughout the region with the other Arab states, and particularly with the wealthy Gulf states, who in the end have far more important things to worry about, like what is their future in a post-hydrocarbon world, than the fate of the Palestinians. I said earlier this year at the Munich Security Conference, not every people gets a state. I'm a Scotsman, so I can speak with some authority on this. And I think the Palestinians had their chance of statehood and blew it. I don't think that chance comes back. I think after the opportunity was thrown away by Arafat, the opportunity that was presented in Oslo and subsequently, you just have to recognize that it's not going to happen. And no number of European governments recognizing a Palestinian state that clearly doesn't exist.
Include Australia in that.
It doesn't make any difference. In fact, it makes a farce of that process of recognition.
It's unrealistic.
Totally. There's nobody I met when I was in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv in February. Nobody, including my left-wing Tel Aviv friends, who still believes in a, quote, two-state solution. The response I got from pretty much everybody was, after October the 7th, you're going to reward them with a state? So I think that possibility has now largely gone in the region, and most people there recognize it. Quite why governments in Australia and in Europe think that they can make a Palestinian state come into existence by making bold declarations, I don't understand.
Well, that immediately raises something that really troubles me. Like you, I absolutely believe that a lot of this is because we've forgotten the Holocaust. I mean, it's extraordinary. You've had people on the progressive side of politics who participated in burning the place down, in protesting against racism, real and perceived, Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it. And we suddenly find that many of those very same people are actually at heart anti-Semitic. They've fallen for the oldest prejudice, ugliest racist form of racism of all, it seems to me.
It's been a very shocking thing for many people. Not so surprising to those of us who were living on university premises. One could see this toxic brew coming some time ago. It is a toxic brew because it combines different strains of anti-Semitism. There's the old Marxist-Leninist Soviet hostility to Israel, which really goes back to the Cold War. Then there's the Islamist anti-Semitism, which has been imported into campuses by the various organizations, often subsidized from abroad, that produce student groups in support of Hamas. And then there's just the old nasty bigotry that originated in the 19th century, if not earlier, and is still around and seldom far from the surface, especially amongst groups that protest their progressive bona fides. And this was a very toxic brew, but for most people it was invisible until October 7th. They couldn't believe their eyes when student groups, not only at Harvard, but at Columbia and at Stanford, came out in support of Hamas, the perpetrators of these hideous, unbelievably grotesque atrocities. That was a shocker, and it was, I think, a reminder to all of us of just how insidious anti-Semitism is, that it can morph, mutate, shapeshift, and turn up, of all places, on the far left. And then you're told by people on the far left, oh no, you're the fascists, and Israel is committing genocide. This is a really strange, topsy-turvy world in which people on the far left accuse Israel of genocide, when in fact the genocidal attack came from Hamas. And what Israel has done is to try to retaliate with the maximum attention to minimizing civilian casualties. It's very hard in Gaza. Anybody who's been there knows that Hamas inhabited tunnels underneath Gaza and used the Palestinian civilians as human shields. But if you compare the Israeli operation in Gaza with any similar military undertaking, actually the striking thing is the relatively low number of civilian casualties there have been. The term genocide has a history. It emerged from the Holocaust when Raphael Lemkin coined it and persuaded the new United Nations to make it a part of our system of international law. So to start using that term as a stick with which to beat Israel after attacks like those of October the 7th last year is completely bizarre to me and ought not to stand up to any slight scrutiny. What's baffling, really baffling to me, John, is that just in the last few days, there are young people in the streets of Australian cities expressing their solidarity with the leader of Hamas. I can't think of anybody who more richly deserved to be killed than that man. And they turn out to hear him praised as a martyr and a hero of jihad. Unbelievable.
I couldn't agree more, because what has happened to two things: our moral compass, that we should have got to that place, but also our understanding of our own interests. Because surely the reality is, surely it's obvious to anybody who gives it a moment's thought, that responsibility for the appalling scenes we see on the footage out of Gaza today lies solely with Hamas. They started it, they wanted it, they knew how to provoke it, they had kept quiet. Jake Sullivan fell into the trap for a couple of years, we know that. Give the impression it's all calm, nothing's coming. So everyone relaxes. You have all of that going on. They at any point, they're the people who could have stopped it. Said, okay, we get the message, it's gone over the top, and we'll release the hostages and we'll stop it. And people want to blame Israel for what is plainly Hamas and its leadership's responsibility.
And let's not forget Hamas's popular support in Gaza, as well as on the West Bank. Substantial percentages, well over half of Palestinians, according to such polling as there is, support Hamas. So it's very difficult for this argument to pass muster when Israel is doing its level best to minimize the civilian casualties, to target the leaders of Hamas and then of Hezbollah. It must be said, this is impressive. I was inside the Israel Defense Ministry back in the spring and saw on the wall in one of the rooms I passed through a large wall chart with all of the Hamas leaders' photographs, most of them with red crosses through them. The same has been done to Hezbollah. It is hard to think of any precedent for this kind of extremely precision-focused warfare, directing your fire at the perpetrators of the crimes. It's a magnificent achievement. It's almost the opposite of genocide, because genocide, remember, implies the indiscriminate destruction of a people and that people's culture and language. This is the opposite of what the Israeli government has been doing since October the 7th. Now, when you see young people in universities or town centres around the world taking the side of terrorists, siding against the one democracy in the region that's trying to defend itself against terrorists. The phrase that comes to mind, John, is useful idiots.
Yes.
There have been useful idiots at various times in modern history. People who sympathize, young people who sympathize with violent extremists. There were useful idiots who sided with the Soviet Union in the mid-20th century and spied, in some cases, for the Soviets, betrayed their own countries. Think of the Cambridge Five. There were useful idiots in the 20th century too. And the people who today chant their support for Hamas, even as Hamas is being obliterated, are simply the useful idiots of our time.
So that's the sort of the moral case, and I entirely agree with you, and you put it beautifully. But then there's the self-interest case. Can't we see what a threat Iran, now teamed up with other opponents of the West, really are to us, and that our actual hard-nosed interests are surely best served by ensuring the degradation of that regime?
It's very important.
And its own people, I'm sure, long for that.
Well, that's
their own people.
Part one of the answer is yes. I mean, this is a deeply unpopular regime. There have been recurrent protests against it. Anybody who knows contemporary Iran knows the hatred that ordinary people feel for the regime. And it's devoutly to be wished for. As Mr. Netanyahu said just the other day, that there should be regime change in Iran. Nothing would benefit the people of Iran more than that. But you raise a geopolitical point, which I think is one of the most important to have emerged in the last 12 months. I don't think it was obvious a year ago that an axis was forming, an axis that brought China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea together. It's now unmistakable. And it was the war in Ukraine that brought these Axis powers together without Chinese support, without Iranian weaponry, without North Korean material, and now men. It is hard to see how Russia's war effort in Ukraine could have been sustained. But it's not only in Ukraine that they're cooperating. Russia is an extremely important player in the Middle East, has been since the Obama administration let the Russians get a foothold in Syria. And so Russia is keenly interested in what happens in the region. It has air defense systems in Syria, which are a great concern to the Israeli Air Force, very vulnerable to those defense systems. China, of course, is the number one buyer of Iranian oil. And the North Koreans, are essentially a criminal totalitarian regime, are merrily supplying men to Russia and weapons to all comers. So this is a new and frightening development, because this axis is in many ways more capable than the axis of the late 1930s. Now people forget this because the phrase axis of evil fell into some disrepute after 2001. It was in early 2002 that George W. Bush referred to the axis of evil in his State of the Union address, referring to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. It didn't exist. It was made up by David Frum, his speechwriter. And I think many people kind of think axis, schmaxis. But this axis today is the real thing. Yeah. And we can see the extent of the cooperation, economic and military, growing with every passing month. This should concern us very much. And so what would be better for us all than for one of these axis powers to crumble? There's no doubt that Iran is the most vulnerable. Its leader is very elderly, Supreme Leader Khamenei, almost certainly the first of the Axis leaders to die, and its regime is detested by the population. So I egg Mr. Netanyahu and his cabinet colleagues on, finish the job, and remember, your position is a great deal stronger than your counterparts 50 years ago, who were much more reliant on American aid than Israel is today.